Did you know? Wind Waker could have had a sequel on the Game Boy Advance. Davide Soliani is best known today as the director of Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle, as well as the guy who cried when Miyamoto acknowledged his hard work on the game. But Davide's connection to Miyamoto actually began 15 years earlier, when he heard the legendary designer was visiting his hometown of Milan, Italy. After spending several days investigating which hotel Miyamoto was staying in, Davide camped out 10 hours in the rain just to get a chance to meet him. When Wind Waker hit store shelves a year later, Davide loved it so much he spent a month developing a Wind Waker sequel on GBA. Nowadays, he's Ubisoft Milan's creative director, but back then he was a humble designer working on games like Rayman and Tomb Raider and didn't have nearly as much clout as he does today. So when he pitched a graphical prototype of Zelda to the managing and studio directors, they decided to kill the project before Nintendo ever got a chance to see it. Davide's partner on the Wind Waker sequel was Ubisoft artist Fabio Paghetti, who told us a little more about how the pitch was born and why it got axed. Paghetti said, "We were both in love with Wind Waker, and Nintendo handhelds were the major focus of Ubisoft Milan at the time, so Davide and I were wondering how Wind Waker would look on GBA. We were always talking and tinkering together about possible concepts and pitches for the studio, and this looked like such a nice fit. Eventually, I prepared this visual mock-up, and we also worked on some 3D test scenes, but we never got the opportunity to pitch the game to Nintendo. The idea of presenting it to Nintendo probably scared Ubisoft, but maybe the game exists in some other fold of the multiverse." According to Davide and Fabio, the prototype and videos they pitched unfortunately no longer exist, unless they're stuck on a hard drive somewhere, so all that remains is this single image. Davide and Fabio didn't know it, but Nintendo was working on a sequel of their own at the exact same time. Unfortunately, Nintendo's attempt was cancelled as well. When Wind Waker launched in 2002, its reception failed to live up to Nintendo's expectations, and the game only ended up selling half as many copies as Ocarina of Time. According to Wind Waker's director Eiji Aonuma, his team spent the following year in the planning stages and early development for Wind Waker 2, but ultimately abandoned the idea of a cel-shaded sequel, primarily due to financial concerns. There are far more Zelda fans in the West than there are in Japan, and Nintendo of America made it clear that Americans wanted a more realistic Zelda, and something closer to Ocarina of Time. According to Aonuma, right after Wind Waker released, we were considering a toon-shaded sequel, but a year later we settled on a more realistic approach. I was told the toon shading gave the impression that Wind Waker was for a younger audience, and that it was alienating the older teenagers that made up most of the fanbase. After hearing that, I started to worry if Wind Waker 2 was something that would actually sell, so the only thing we could do was give the American market the Zelda they were asking for. In the 2016 hardcover publication The Legend of Zelda Art and Artifacts, designer-manager Satoru Takizawa provided a little more insight on the direction Wind Waker 2 was headed before its development changed course. He said the proposed setting for Wind Waker 2 was not on the sea but on land. The desire to depict Toon Link on a horse riding around the Great Plains was great. However, with his small stature and short arms and legs, it would have been difficult to make him look good on a horse. It wasn't like we could make an adult version of Toon Link, and that was about the time we heard that people were wanting a realistic-looking Zelda game again. Development was quickly redirected to be more in line with Ocarina of Time, and although Toon Link did eventually return on the Nintendo DS, he never got a chance to ride a horse on the big screen as Nintendo originally envisioned. After 3 more years in development, Twilight Princess released in 2006. It turned out Nintendo of America was right. Realistic Zelda sold more than twice as many copies as Wind Waker. Nintendo decided to capitalize on the game's success with a direct sequel, just like they'd done on the Nintendo 64. According to Miyamoto, the terrain created for Twilight Princess was vast. I really thought there was more we could do with it, so after we finished with the development of Twilight Princess, I talked to the staff about whether or not we could do a side story. With a big series like Zelda, we usually only release a new version every 3 to 5 years, but we thought it'd be great to make something for those people that really enjoyed Twilight Princess where they'd be able to keep playing in the same world. The Zelda team started pre-production on a Majora-style sequel, but the idea Miyamoto chose in the end was a small side story based on the Wii Zapper. The Zelda team was shocked when they heard Miyamoto's decision, as it meant killing all the big ideas they'd started working on. Some felt strongly he wasn't making the right call, so Miyamoto proposed a compromise. They'd make a prototype for the Zapper side story and have it playtested, and if the focus group didn't like it, the Zelda team wouldn't have to make the Zapper game. The focus group ended up loving the prototype, and the project ultimately evolved into Link's Crossbow training. But Miyamoto's team kept pushing to make it bigger, so we ended up making a list of rules. The developers couldn't add anything unnecessary to the game's simple concept, and every stage had to be shorter than 3 minutes. There couldn't be any story cutscenes, and the game couldn't have any bosses. But his team kept pushing. According to Miyamoto, they kept kept bugging him to include boss battles, so he finally gave in and agreed, but said they could only make one boss. Despite Miyamoto's orders, they wound up making two, the Dark Nut and the Stall Lord. The Zelda team was heartbroken when their ideas for a Twilight sequel ended up on the cutting room floor, but Link's crossbow training proved to be the right business decision. The game sold nearly 6 million copies, almost 2 million more than Wind Waker. Not everyone was happy with the side story, but crossbow training did have one very important fan, series producer Eiji Aonuma. He actually pitched a sequel with improved gameplay and online multiplayer, as he explained to Games TM in 2009. To tell you the truth, I actually wanted to create Link's crossbow training too. I thought we should do something more and better in the field of the first-person shooter, based on our experience making the first game. For example, I was thinking maybe we could intensify the multiplayer mode. The original was really just a solo game, but I thought we could add a true multiplayer mode with multiple users playing together over Wi-Fi. Nintendo's higher-ups didn't share Aonuma's enthusiasm, however, and told him he should focus on the main series. After his Crossbow Training 2 pitch was rejected, Aonuma got to work making a Majora-style sequel to Phantom Hourglass, which launched 2 years later as Spirit Tracks. Although most Zelda fans have played every mainline Zelda game, few have played Four Swords, which released alongside A Link to the Past on GBA. By connecting up to 4 GBAs together with link cables, friends could explore randomly generated dungeons cooperatively, but also competitively, as each player was ranked on total rupees collected. 2 years later, it was followed up with Four Swords Adventure, where each player used a link cable to connect their GBA to a GameCube. Everyone shared the TV, but if a player went off in their own direction, gameplay switched to their GBA screen. Partly due to the multiplayer hardware components, Adventures never managed to sell even 1 million copies. But shortly before the DS released in 2005, Miyamoto suggested the DS would make this hardware issue a thing of the past. He said, at the time of GameCube and GBA connectivity, you had to connect the system to 4 GBAs, so the price of entry was a bit high. However, the DS has 2 screens and Wi-Fi support, so we feel the threshold is a lot lower. We're thinking of bringing Zelda Four Swords to the DS. And in another interview, the game's producer Eiji Aonuma told Club Nintendo the Zelda team is already planning Four Swords for the Nintendo DS. This game will have a lot of connectivity and feature a lot of interaction between both screens. It will be interesting. But a year later, Aonuma backtracked on his previous quote, suggesting Four Swords DS turned into Phantom Hourglass during the game's prototype phase. The game's director Daiki Iwamoto eventually shed a little more light on how the Four Swords team ended up producing something completely different. They stated, it was around May 2004, right after we finished Four Swords Adventures. The DS hadn't been released yet, and the game was in the experimental stage. We started by trying many ideas on how to use the stylus and wanted to continue exploring the theme of connectivity between 2 different screens. Eventually, Aonuma said, let's try something different. So we started to think about a new type of Zelda system, one that would become a standard for the DS. In the end, a 3rd entry in the Four Swords series was never produced. But it's worth mentioning that the original GBA game got a remaster on DS called Four Swords Anniversary Edition, released in 2011 to celebrate the franchise's 25th birthday. The DS remaster added lots of updates and brand new content, including a single-player mode, wireless connectivity, and new stages based on Zelda 1, A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening. The Anniversary Edition never got a physical release and was only available for digital download for 5 months on DS, then for just 4 days on 3DS a few years later. As a result, it's been unobtainable since 2014, meaning most Zelda fans never got a chance to experience the Four Swords remaster. In 2009, rumors spread that Retro Studios was working on a Zelda game for Wii, but those rumors weren't proven until May 2020, when concept art was found on an ArtStation account for Sammy Hall, who previously worked at Retro Studios on games like Metroid Prime 3 and Donkey Kong Country Returns. According to Hall, the concept art was from a cancelled Zelda project that would have taken place in the Bad Timeline, the timeline where Ganon defeated Link at the end of Ocarina of Time. Instead of Link, the spin-off starred the last surviving male Sheikah, after the rest of the Sheikah were wiped out in a genocidal event. The last Sheik's journey was planned as an origin story for the Master Sword, and the plot used the Gerudo's 100-year birth of Ganon as a backdrop. Hall's notes reveal the project began in 2005 during the Wii era, but ended up being cancelled in 2008. Retro's post-apocalyptic Hyrule took some visual inspiration from Twilight Princess, while also introducing lots of brand new ideas. Concept art included enemy types labeled Clock Kids, as well as Deku Warriors, the Lord of the Swamp, and several designs that may be bosses. There was also the Dark Valu race, creatures features clearly connected to Wind Waker's Valoo. Some concept art was titled Autumn, implying a use of seasons, possibly inspired by Oracle of Seasons. According to Sammy Hall, it was very experimental stuff, but games in the Zelda universe have very weird stuff, and this game was setting out to be 10 times weirder. 3 days after his artwork was first spotted by Metroid fan site Shinesparkers, Hall gave IGN a brief statement explaining the game was still in pre-production when it got cancelled, adding it was mostly handled internally at Retro without much involvement from Nintendo HQ. According to Hall, the game was cooked up by 3 Retro leads, including Mark Pacini, the director of Metroid Prime 1, 2, and 3. But production came to a halt when all 3 of them quit Retro to start their own studio in April 2008. Just a few hours after he spoke with IGN, Hall's social media was deleted, and even his Patreon account got pulled down, making fans speculate Nintendo, or possibly Retro's legal department, were the ones who pulled the plug. Since then, anyone involved has been unable or unwilling to comment, and no further details have been made public. However, it's important to note that Sammy Hall uploaded all this concept art after finding it on an old hard drive, so it's possible that other Retro employees still have more artwork and documents that hopefully someday might find their way onto the internet, revealing more about the 3-year project. A few months after Link's Awakening was re-released with some updates on the Game Boy Color, Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto approached Miyamoto about remaking Zelda 1 in the style of Link's Awakening. Perhaps wanting to avoid a repeat of the CDI debacle, Miyamoto blew him off, but Okamoto refused to take no for an answer, threatening to produce a rip-off if Miyamoto didn't say yes. In a 1999 interview with German magazine Total, Okamoto explained how the Trilogy project came into existence. He said, "I especially like the Zelda on Famicom, but Nintendo just wasn't interested in translating it onto the Game Boy Color. So I told Mr. Miyamoto that I wanted to produce the game, but nothing ever came of it, so I had to threaten him." The magazine, probably shocked, asked him to repeat himself. "You threatened him?" "I said if Nintendo doesn't want to do it, Capcom will make an identical game, but just change the name of the game and all the characters." Then he asked if we wanted to develop the game legitimately. We immediately accepted. Eventually, a deal was struck that after the remake was complete, Capcom would follow it up with a trilogy of brand new games called the Triforce series. As producer, Okamoto was meant to supervise the remake's development, but ended up spending most of his time overseas, so the project was led by Capcom director Hidemaru Fujibayashi. If that name sounds familiar, it's because after the partnership between Capcom and Nintendo was dissolved, Fujibayashi was hired to work directly for Nintendo and later served as director on Breath of the Wild, and is currently directing its sequel. In many ways, Breath of the Wild was a reimagining of Zelda 1, but at the time, Fujibayashi wasn't as enthusiastic about remaking Zelda 1 as his boss Okamoto. The Capcom team felt Zelda 1 was too difficult for the modern generation of gamers, so they ended up scrapping the remake and skipping ahead to development of the Triforce series. According to Miyamoto, the Tale of Power was originally planned to launch in late 1999 and focus on action, followed up a few months later with the puzzle-based Tale of Wisdom, and then a few months after that, the trilogy would conclude with the Tale of Courage. All 3 games would be connected with passwords, so after completing one game, fans could continue their adventure in the next installment. It was expected that fans would play the trilogy in the order they were released, but they were being developed in a way that fans could play the games in any order they wanted. The Triforce series was initially planned to make use of the mobile system GB, a service that allowed fans to connect a Game Boy Color to the internet by using a cell phone adapter. Miyamoto said, "The original idea for those games was for them to be more episodic in content, and the development actually started with the notion of potentially trying to sell dungeons individually. Linking all 3 games together proved too much for the team, however, so Okamoto made more than just a call for help. He had to send out an SOS for Miyamoto to ride in on a white horse and save the trilogy from development hell. To get the project back on course, Miyamoto cut the series from 3 games down to just 2, and any ideas involving online features were thrown out as well. The games were temporarily rebranded as the Mysterious Seeds series, but in the end, the Tale of Power became Oracle Seasons, and the Tale of Wisdom became Oracle of Ages. After more than a year of delays, instead of releasing episodically, the games finally launched together in February 2001. Bits and pieces of the cancelled Zelda 1 remake found their way into Seasons. Both games have a western graveyard, and the first dungeon can be found inside a dead tree on a small island, and even the dungeons' internal layouts are similar. 6 of Seasons' dungeon bosses were also taken from Zelda 1. As for the Tale of Courage, also known as the Mystical Seed of Courage, it's impossible to know exactly how much made its way into Oracle of Ages and Seasons, but in addition to the online features, we do know a few more pieces of the puzzle that got left out. The 2 games that survived made use of magic items called the Harp of Ages and the Rod of Seasons, while concept art revealed in the Hyrule Historia suggests the last game in the trilogy was was planned around the magic paintbrush, an item that would have taken full advantage of the Game Boy Color. The Oracle Nairu plays a central role in Ages, and Din stars in Seasons, while the third game was originally planned to feature Furori. Since the game was never finished, Furori ended up with just a small token role in Ages and Seasons, essentially as a password clerk in the Hall of Secrets. Some websites claim that Capcom was also planning to remake Zelda 2 for the Game Boy Color, but we couldn't find any credible evidence to support that claim, even after talking to Okamoto himself. So it appears the idea of Capcom remaking Zelda 2 was nothing more than a rumor, but there has been some legitimate interest in remaking Zelda 2 over the years, not only from outside studios, but also from Shigeru Miyamoto himself. Miyamoto has gone on record more than once saying Zelda 2 was one of his biggest regrets, even referring to the game as a failure. So in the early 90s, he began working on a Super Nintendo remake with Zelda and Mario alumni Yoshiaki Koizumi. If the game made heavy use of polygons, it was probably running on the Super FX chip, a co-processor that allowed for incredibly advanced graphics for its time, powering both Star Fox and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. The project was ultimately cancelled, but buzz surrounding a potential remake has continued to this day, most recently in 2018 when Inti Creates CEO Takuya Aizu said Zelda 2 was his dream remake. Inti Creates is famous for breathing new life into old games and big IP belonging to other companies, like they did with Mega Man 9 and 10 and Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon. So we reached out to Mr. Aizu to ask what a Zelda 2 remake might look like with him in the driver's seat. Aizu told us, "If we were to start development right away, I think it would be very aware of its Famicom disk system roots. But if this dream remake were to happen a few years down the road, I think it would be made in a way that would be most suitable for players at that time using the best development techniques we have available at Inti Creates. But if you talk too much about your dreams, they cease to be dreams, so I think I'll leave it at that." He told us discussions with Nintendo hadn't taken place, at least not yet, so we took the liberty of sending our email directly to Nintendo in hopes that someday, Inti Creates might get the chance to add Zelda 2 to their long list of retro remakes. If you want more Zelda facts, check out the videos on screen. If you like this video, give it a like, and feel free to subscribe for more facts from DidYouKnowGaming.